For homework 10, this is the last video that will show my top level of the whole system coming together. Once again, my homework is the traffic light, and just to recap on what the modifications that I'm doing to this one is modifying the traffic light so that it counts the number of cars that trigger the sensors, and modifying the traffic light so that it stays green for a specific amount of time in the east-west direction once it's been triggered. So let's look at the top level code. So my top level code for my inputs, I have a clock, and a clear. The clear is basically it will reset the whole system, and I have another input that's car EW, or which stands for car east west. So this is the input from the sensors from the east west or west to east directions. And then my output is my traffic lights. The way that it's set up is that the first letter is the color, and the last two is the direction. Um, So like RNS stands for red, north, south. YNS is yellow, north, south, and so forth. REW stands for red, east, west. And I have a outputting the count, um, which is the number of cars that trigger the sensor that triggers the sensors for the east-west direction. And my output here is 3 bits. I try to make it as big as as big as I felt needed. But for this, I didn't really want to make it too big, so that's the reason why I made it 3 bits. Um, so in my architecture, I have 3 signals. One signal is TL, which stands for traffic lights, and which is 6 bits, and it's the outputs from the finite state machine. And the reason why I made it 6 bits is because my traffic light originally is I have 6 traffic lights. Even though both directions have their own lights, is that the lights themselves will mirror each other. For instance, the north-south traffic light as well as the south to north traffic light will mirror each other, so they'll operate at the same time, as well as the east to west and west to east will operate at the same time. So which is why I have 6 bits for my output for TL from the finite state machine. My signal for the control is 2 bits, and this is the data path for the finite state machine to the counter. Um, so the least, so the reason why it's 2 bits is because I have the least significant bit controls the counter for when the car is triggering the sensors to count the number of cars doing that, as well as the the timer. So once east west is green, it'll enable the timer to begin incrementing. And I have a signal for the watch time, which basically it holds the value from the timer of the counter, so we can keep track of that as well. And this will also feed into the finite state machine as well too. So here, for these 2 components, these are my declaration for my components of the finite state machine and the counter. For my finite state machines ports, they're the same as was in my entity for the FSM, which is the clock and reset, the sensor, the timer, the control, and T lights, as well as for my component for the counter. My inputs would be clock reset, car, WT, which stands for watch timer. Then my outputs is timer and count. And here I instantiated my components. So I labeled my FSM component as T, and for my instantiation, because T standing for traffic. And here, this is where I tied my my signals together. So my clock from my top level will be tied to my clock of my finite state machine. Clear is tied to reset. Car EW is tied to the sensor, which will be the input for the finite state machine. And watch time, which is one of my signals here, is tied to the timer input for the FSM. So which also comes from the counter. And yeah, which is the value from the counter, which will feed back into the finite state machine. And I have my control, my CO and TR from my finite state machine from holds the control from the finite state machine, which will then feed into the counter. Um, and my T lights goes into my TL signal, which is the output of the finite state machine. For my counter, I labeled it as C. Um, C standing for counter. And here I tied the clock from the top level clock reset to the clear in the top level, which will reset the whole system. WT is tied to control 1, which basically, because my control is 2 bits, WT is correlates to the most significant bit of the control signal, and CAR is tied to control 0, which is the least significant bit of my control signal, which is the reason why I made control the signal control as a vector that's 2 bits wide, which helps make it easier for coding purposes as far as typing goes. And my watch time is my timer is tied to my watch time, which comes from the finite state machine. I'm sorry, which comes from the counter that feeds into the finite state machine. And my count is outputted to my count. My count from the counter is outputted to the count in the top level. Um, Here, these are my outputs. These are the traffic lights for the north-south and south to north lights, because they do mimic each other, mirror each other. So my R and S, or red north-south, is tied to TL5. Um, so here, TL, as you can see, is I'm only accessing a particular bit that is high, and those particular bits stands for when those lights are on. So here, the most significant bit for TL, I dictated that as being red. I'm sorry, yeah, as being red. So when the most significant bit is 0, this red light will be off, and it will go so forth. So Y and S is TL4, that's the 4th bit. G and S is the 3rd bit of TL, and REW is the 2nd bit of TL. Yellow East West is the 1st bit of TL, and green East West is the least significant bit of TL. And let's take a look at the waveform. So for the waveform here, to begin with, I made my clear to be a 1 to reset the to basically go ahead and reset the system so that therefore it can begin. The reset also allows the state machine to begin at state 0 to, and it also helps instantiate the counter as well to 0, so that we don't have any undefined values. So it will remain, so here clear is 1. As you can see that because when it's 1, we would reset it, the finite state machine will be at state 0. So the traffic light colors are green is north-south, and east-west is also red, as we can see, because it also resets the counter. The count is 000. control is 00, which is the output from the finite state machine, and the watch time is 000, which is the output from the counter. So in our next clock cycle, I force clear to be 0 and car EW is 0. So the sensor is not detecting any vehicles on the east-west or west-east direction. Um, so it's still in state 0. North-south is still green and east-west is still red. Count is still 0. Control still 00. So neither the counter and the timer is enabled. And watch time is still 0. And just to show that when the sensor is not detecting anything for car EW, that it will still remain in state 0. So north-south is still green, east-west is still red, count is still 0, the control are still both 00, and watch time is still 0. So then the next cycle, I have forced the value of car EW to be 1, so which means that now the sensor has detected a vehicle. However, it won't be registered yet until the next clock cycle for it to now change states. So at this point, we are still in state 0. And the next clock cycle here, we can now see the change. We can now see that north-south is now is off, so the light for north-south is now yellow, which is on. And then east-west is still red, and now that control is now 0, 1. So that least significant bit is going to trigger the counter for the sensor to begin incrementing. But right now, we won't see the change because right now count is still 0. We won't see the change until the next clock cycle. And then here, at this part, now north south is now red, and east west is still red, but the counter has incremented by 1, so from 0 to 1, and our control is now 0, 0, and the watch time is still 0, 0, 0 because east west has not become green yet. And so here, as you can see from the last cycle or the last state, from state 1, control is 0, 1. So we enabled the counter for the sensor. And then here, state 2, we disabled it. So therefore, the counter will no longer increment at this point until it goes back, until the state machine cycles back and gets to state 1. So in state 3, we have and the traffic light in state 2 is now north-south is now red, just in case I haven't mentioned it yet. And east-west is also still red. So in state 3, north-south remains to be red, and now east-west is now green. And the count is still at 1, so it has been disabled, and the control is now 1, 0. So the most significant bit for control is now going to enable the timer portion of the counter, and the counter at this point is still 0, 0, 0, which will change at the next clock cycle. We are still in state 3 in this cycle. Timer has incremented, and because the control is still 1, 0, and the traffic light is still east west is green and north south is still red. Okay, this is regardless of whether or not the sensor is still on. It could be that cars are still triggering as as they step on the sensor as they're moving. But with the way that this particular system is set up is that we're allowing this green light for east-west to be green for a certain amount of time, which we dictated to be um, 3 seconds or 3 cycles. Um, we're still in state 3 at this point. Timer is now 2. The control is still 1-0, so the timer still is enabled. East-west is still green, north-south is still red. And the next state, now we've reached where the timer is 3 and the control is still 1-0. East-west is still green and north-south is still red. And here we have, so if here at state 3, the maximum amount of time is 3 seconds. So once it reaches 3 seconds, the finite state machine will then move from state 3 to state 4. As we can see here, the control has changed from 1-0 to 0-0. And now the light has also changed. And the lights currently right now is that east-west has changed from green to yellow now, as we can see here. And north-south is still red. And the counter, because once it registers, it has incremented for that clock cycle, for the next clock cycle to be a 4. So, but then once the next clock cycle, it will be 0-0-0. In state 5 is we can see the timer, the watch time has reset it itself to 0-0-0, and that's due because the control is 0-0. So, and this is in state 5. The lights currently is east-west is red and north-south is red. And the next is from state 5. We'll go ahead. Well, it'll move to state 0, where now north-south is now green and east-west remains to be red. And if we continue on, as long as we keep car EW to be a 1, it'll then move from state 0 to state 1. It'll cycle through itself. And that's it for the traffic light controller.